Dr. Valson Thampu, and we really praise God for he is truly a blessing from the Lord who always comes whenever we call upon him to preach in this fellowship. Just a quick introduction of Dr. Valson Thampu. Valson Thampu is an Indian educator, Christian theologian, and who was former principal of St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi from 2008 to February 2016. Prior to this, he was a lecturer and the officiating principal since May 2007. He's a translator from Malayalam to English, and his translation of The Scent of the Other Side won the Crossword Award. His second translated work, Gift in Green, was published by the HarperCollins in 2011. Prior to that, he served as a member of the Delhi Minorities Commission for 2 terms and was also the member of the National Commission for Minority Education Institution. He was nominated twice to the National Integration Council under the category Distinguished Citizens of India. There were controversies that he faced in his tenure at St. Stephen's College, about which he's written in the book On a Stormy Cause. He has also been an ordained minister of the Church of North India and a member of the National Minorities Commission and Delhi Minorities Commission. Valson Thampu pursued PhD in theology from SAM, Higginbotham Institute of Agriculture, Technology and Sciences. In view of irreversible spiritual degeneration that churches in India have suffered, he renounced his priesthood in 2016. Okay, so we are truly glad to have you once again to share the word of God. Over to you now.
Thank you, Abhishek. It's always a matter of much personal happiness to share this fellowship with all of you. It's for the first time, actually, that I'm speaking at a meeting held later than, say, 9 o'clock. So it must be an act of courage, because in the days that I used to be a busy convention preacher, and convention messages used to start by about 8 o'clock. By the time I finished, several people used to be fast asleep. So that being the case, I can only hope that all of you and we finished together. Anyway, since we are a very small group, the margin of attrition would also be small. Anyway, today marks the commencement of the season of Lent, as a time set apart for Christians all over the world to meditate on the mission of Jesus Christ. Or sometimes it's said there is a time to meditate on the suffering of Jesus Christ. The suffering of Jesus Christ is very important, but I can never separate his suffering from his mission. So I would like to widen the scope of the Lent by putting the focus on the mission of Jesus Christ, which of course is punctuated very brightly and unforgettably by his unique suffering. Now, one thing I want to say by way of introduction or the prefatory statement, whenever we think of the spiritual aspect of life, it would be necessary to balance that what we say with its opposite. For example, as Abhijit quite rightly said, our life is fleeting. There's nothing permanent in this world. At the same time, we're also children of eternity. So we are atoms of eternity implanted in time, which is constantly fleeting. Secondly, again, as he said, and I think the second hymn sort of underscored it, or first hymn or second one. Um, we're living in a particular period in history, a particular culture, and we have a particular way of life. And we feel that the world surrounds us and presses itself upon us, colonizes us, that pressures of life often become too much for us to cope, to handle, etc. It is true that the modern culture is invasive. It is true that pressures of circumstances, pressures of life have increased a great deal, especially in the last 50 years. That not only because of technology, though technology is a main driver of change, there are various other contributing factors to this escalation of existential pressures upon us. But let's also remember that when Jesus began his ministry, the Jews also lived under great stress and strain. See, we have had the experience of being colonized. India, first by the Mughals, then by the British. So, living in bondage, living in a state of slavery, is a life which is pressed down by forces extraneous to us. So, what happens in slavery, what happens in colonization, is that our internal life becomes, say, passive, and we are forced to live according to pressures and compulsions external to us. And that was precisely the context in which Jesus lived and undertook his mission. Therefore, what did he do? And this is something important, therefore, I'll plead with you to understand this. Jesus lived at a period somewhat similar to us, minus technology, though that period also had its own technology. But the external pressures that Jesus and his contemporaries had to cope with were really very, very grave and serious. Therefore, what did Jesus do? This is of great relevance to us. And Lent is a good season to remind ourselves of this. Jesus quickened the inner life of the people. See, when the world around us is very powerful, very coercive, very intimidating, and forces us to conform to its ways, the best strategy is to quicken our inner life, to become stronger from within. So the pressures of the world seem to be too strong and too overwhelming, corresponding as how weak we are internally. So the only sane strategy in circumstances like this is to grow in our inner strength. For example, why did Jesus go into the wilderness before he commenced his public ministry? Being in the wilderness is a period of intense exploration of the inner self in light of the eternal, in the presence of God, without the distractions of culture, organized way of life, including the political structure, which was oppressive and exploitative at that time, which is also what we are moving into. In fact, Christians will, in the near future, be very much like under the Roman domination. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. Anyway, that's not my main theme today. So, the thoughts that I'm going to share with you, therefore, will be somewhat focused on this. The need to shift our spiritual focus from the external world to the internal resources that God has already invested in us. And this is not to say that we must become indifferent to or allergic to the world around us. We can never be a world denying people because God loves the world. At the same time, the world has become so invasive so overpowering that it denies us even the minimum breathing space to be truly ourselves. And this problem is going to aggravate. I don't know if you're aware of this, that in the state of Assam, a Hindu outfit, I mean, one of the Parivar outfits, has given instructions or orders to all Christian institutions not to show Christian symbols in public, not to have religious instructions in schools. Priests and nuns should not wear cassocks and habits, so on and so forth. This is part of the cultural assimilation of a people, and I'm just flagging it. It's a huge subject. We need to be also aware of what's happening around us, and very soon these things will catch up with each one of us. At that time, we should not be caught unawares. All right, now, as a focal point for our meditation, let's think of Jesus' formulation of the shaping purpose of his ministry. I have in mind the 10th verse of the 10th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus says, "The thief comes to scatter, to destroy, to kill, but I have come that they may have life and life in all its fullness." So I think during the season of Lent, we should put the focus on life. And in fact, in our spiritual life henceforth, we should put our focus unwaveringly on the concept, on the gift, on the marvel or the miracle of life. And that's indeed what we see as the most significant or striking feature of Jesus' spiritual vision and his mission. So, what did Jesus mean by saying that he came that we may have life in all its fullness? Now, we are undertaking this meditation at a time when people are finding it hard to endure their life. For example, suicides are increasing by leaps and bounds. And even in the case of the people who do not commit suicide, they do not consider life as a blessing. Very few are the people who experience the sweetness of life. So something seriously wrong is happening. And in spite of the fact that the proclamation of the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, has gone on and on and on and on, unfortunately, the value of life is coming down and the felicity of life is taking a beating. And as a faith community or as a spiritual people called upon to be the witnesses to the quality of life that Jesus offered to the world, we are failing in this respect. I don't say this in order to criticize ourselves. I say this in order to remind us that there is a very significant mission to be undertaken, and that mission must begin with us. So that will be the focus of our meditation today. Now, when Jesus says that he came that we may have life in all its fullness, what he means, first of all, is that the norm, the prevailing norm, then and now, is not fullness of life. Somehow, human beings are incapable of receiving the gift of life in its fullness. Now, there is a paradox here. On the one hand, everybody is in love with life. We are so much in love with life that we don't want to die. Very often we mention the prospect of death with great fear and trepidation. Why are we so afraid to die? Is it because we are in love with life? Or is it because we are terrified of death? What is it? We need clarity on this. All right? Now, if our life is not worth living, then what does it matter that we die today or tomorrow? If our life is not a tremendous value, why go through all this nonsense? In fact, that is the central question in existential philosophy. The philosophers of the last century said that life is a meaningless sequence of absurd events that don't add up to anything, The whole thing is meaningless. Therefore, it makes good sense to end this nonsense. So they recommended suicide. This is what is called metaphysical nihilism. Anyway, so Jesus identifies this as a universal and timeless spiritual issue. Unfortunately and surprisingly, the Christian church, Christendom, Christian countries, Christian cultures, Christian societies have almost consistently neglected this. I don't know why. We are obsessed with all kinds of other things, but we tend to move away from the very heart of the matter as identified by Jesus. Therefore, my attempt is to put the focus back on where it belongs. So, according to Jesus, the one universal human incapacity is the incapacity for life. At the same time, everybody recognizes in theory that there is no value greater than the value of life. There's nobody who would say that life is worthless, man. You can say that some people make their life worthless, but life per se is the highest, greatest, noblest, absolute value. And yet nobody bothers to live it in its fullness. So this is the problem to which Jesus Christ's public mission, his ministry, is a redemptive response. Okay, so let's fix it very clearly in our mind. Now, when Jesus says you must have life in its fullness, Jesus is also introducing another very major issue. The first issue we have identified is that though in theory we recognize life to be the absolute value, in practice we neglect it. The second issue is, and again, that issue is embedded in Jesus' statement. That's why I'm flagging it for you. Human beings have a tendency to relate to everything, including life, only in terms of a very small part. We are not really interested in relating to life in its fullness. First of all, there's a problem with our attitude to life. Secondly, complicating that, we somehow are completely indifferent to having life in its fullness. Now the problem is this: why is this such a problem? It's such a problem because life can be had only in its fullness. This is something that most people don't realize. Why? Because life is dynamic, and anything which is dynamic cannot be had in part. For example, laughter is dynamic, right? You cannot have half a laugh. Breathing is dynamic, right? You cannot have half a breath, because half a breath will kill you. All right? Now, suppose you're walking. You raise one leg, you have to bring it down and complete the walk. Take anything which is dynamic, it can exist only in its totality. But strange it is that though life is dynamic and life is nothing but dynamic, we do not want to have it in its full, in its wholeness. Now, in the Bible or in the Gospels, Jesus says to people, look, your faith has made you whole. Remember that word? Whole. Now we have ministry of healing, but we don't have ministry of wholeness. You understand? Why? Because we understand healing merely as curing. Certain symptoms are removed, but the problem remains. Our incapacity for life remains. So, what Jesus envisages all the time is wholeness, WHOLENESS. That is completeness. Why? Because any state which falls short of wholeness indicates incapacity for life. And this is actually the operating principle of sin. Now, in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, God tells Adam, you should not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because the day you eat thereof, you will die. Now, that's not physical death. It is death, the principle of death invading the framework of life. And what is the principle of death? This partness as against wholeness. Life has to be whole. Anything short of the whole is oriented to death. Death will happen today, tomorrow, maybe 10 years from now, but it is sure to die. So there's no permanence in what is fragmentary. For example, if a limb from the body is cut off, then it will perish, it will putrefy. Whereas if it dwells in the body, it has a much longer life. But then again, it will putrefy because when the soul departs from the body, it becomes incomplete and it begins to putrefy. As long as the soul dwells within the body, it cannot putrefy. There is still hope. You understand? So we have to understand this principle that the only goal, nothing short of this will do. The necessary goal is life in its fullness. Okay? I hope that's clear, at least to some extent. But if clarification is required, I'm willing to provide it by and by. Now the question is, okay, this is the goal, right? How are we to achieve it? Jesus says, I have come that you may have it. Now, unfortunately, what has happened for 2000 years is that we have interpreted this in a cultic manner. You believe in Jesus Christ, you give your heart to Jesus Christ, and thereafter you are in fullness of life. Now, I'm afraid that is not how it works. Though this is how it's been presented and preached for so many centuries. And that's the reason why, for all our many, many religious enterprises, crusades, and revival meetings, etc., the ground reality doesn't change. People are left behind. They live the same kind of miserable life. So there has to be a change in this respect. So therefore, in order to understand what fullness of life means, there's only one thing we can do, and that is look at Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the model of life in its fullness. It stands to reason, it makes good common sense, that he who has come to lead us to fullness of life will himself be the best example of fullness of life. Is that clear? If you want to have an example or a role model for fullness of life, you cannot have anyone better than Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is the only person in history who said, I've come that the whole of mankind, humankind, must have fullness of life. No one else has said this. You understand? Therefore, the only person, in my understanding, the only person who is reliable as a guide to fullness of life is Jesus Christ. I hope that also is clear. Now let's look at Jesus Christ. Okay? When I look at Jesus Christ, I see particularly three dimensions to his personality, all of which are basic to being human. After all, Jesus is the Son of God, become the Son of Man. And throughout his public ministry, Jesus referred to himself only as the Son of Man, the Son of Man, right? Though he said, my Father and I are one, so on and so forth. But when he referred to himself, he always referred to himself as the Son of Man. Now, when as a young person I turned to Jesus Christ, I was quite struck by his emotional richness. I don't know how many of you have realized this. Um, when I look around, both in the biblical narratives as well as the world in which I live, I find people, most people, as incapable of emotional richness. Now, for example, I've been teaching literature. When I regard 20th century literature, one of the things I invariably notice in whether it is German literature, Russian literature, French literature, British literature, American literature, uh, whichever literature, one thing that I invariably notice is the emotional poverty of the modern man. The modern man cannot feel. He is desensitized. And this is the reason why interpersonal relationships become so disappointing, so annoying, and therefore people enter into relationships, but they live discontented and disenchanted all through their life. It's a tragedy, the exact magnitude of which people don't recognize. So we don't really talk about these things because they're very embarrassing. The famine that's afflicting humankind, particularly in modern times, is the famine of emotional life. Young people, they fall in love with each other. Romantic love results in matrimony. And it doesn't take very long for this enchantment to set in. I don't have to explain this. I don't have to describe it either. Take friendships, for example, leave alone man woman relationship. Like, take friendship. When I examine the lives of great men in the past, and in the Bible also, you'll see this, say the relationship between David and Jonathan. Huh? You find very rich friendships. In Greek philosophy, Greek culture, they attached great importance to friendship because they felt that friendship brought out the best from a human being. But that has to be friendship of a certain kind. Now, for example, you think of the attraction that children felt towards Jesus. Do you think children are attracted by intellectual brilliance or by emotional richness? Emotional richness. Think of Jesus weeping at the tomb of Lazarus. Think of Jesus weeping over the degradation of the city of Jerusalem. Think of Jesus burning with indignation at the corruption of the Jerusalem temple, denouncing what the priestly class in those days did, turning it into a den of thieves. And he says, the zeal for my father's house consumes me. Where is that emotional vitality gone? Now it's as though we are half alive, half dead. Very much like the Christians in the church of Sardis. You have the name of being alive, but you are dead. Or even the members of the church at Laodicea, neither hot nor cold, but lukewarm. You understand what a serious problem it is? So we cannot experience life in its fullness if our emotional life remains as poor and bankrupt as it is. I say this, I have to make a confession to you that because I coveted the life of a scholar, I buried myself among books from my early days. Actually, books were my friends. But too late in my life, I realized that while books gave me a lot of ideas, it was also serving as a source of my personal impoverishment. It impoverished my emotional life. I actually compromised my human need to relate, to love, and to be loved. to laugh with people who laugh, to cry with people who cry, to empathize, and maybe to lose my sleep because someone is suffering somewhere. How smug, how comfortable we have become in a world of suffering. It's an astonishing thing. It's a shocking reality that we can sleep so well. Why do you think Jesus went about doing good without rest or any kind of apologies? Because he felt for the people, felt. When Jesus looked at the people, what did he say? They're like sheep without a shepherd. He felt for them, right? Do you think Jesus would have made a difference to the life of the people if his emotional aspect was poor? He would not have had any impact whatsoever. Now, I have to say this to you at this point in time that the devastation that sin brings about in human beings is desensitization. The more sinful we are, the more hard hearted we become. You remember Pharaoh? Why was Pharaoh hard hearted? Because his entire political structure was based on exploiting people without a modicum of sense of justice. To be just, you have to be emotionally alive. To be truthful. Now, what's the commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, all your strength. How can you do that? It's not love and emotion. What was the difference between the Good Samaritan and the priest and the Levite? The Good Samaritan had a heart that was beating for the man who was wounded. But the priest and the Levite had hearts of stone. Therefore, they became totally useless, fruitless. You understand the problem? So it's very important that our emotional life is enriched. And that's something that we learn from Jesus of Nazareth. The second thing I find, again, this is something that attracted me as a young person. I was astonished at Jesus's creative thinking. For example, he taught through parables, right? Parables are stories thought up on the spur of the moment. I'm astonished, having spent a lifetime teaching Western literature. I'm astonished that somebody can have that kind of creativity. And each story is meant to serve as a medium for conveying a thought. A thought. And we know that Jesus has prioritized teaching people over performing miracles, right? So Jesus had a very intense, very rich, almost unrivaled intellectual life. This is something that the church fights hard against. Because over the years, for whatever reasons, we have developed a piety which is allergic to intellectual development. We think that thinking is a sin. Now, many people have told me that scholarship will make you rebellious. Don't read books, your mind will turn. But that's not what I find in my Lord and my Master. I consider him to be the greatest thinker of all times. He's certainly far superior to all the philosophers I have read, and I have read many, because philosophers, end of the day, are dry. Jesus was intensely, richly human in his thinking. Now, without that thinking capacity, you cannot imagine Jesus. Jesus minus the richness of his thinking capacity is unthinkable. But then what does it mean to think? Now, for example, a thief also thinks, right? A thief has to think very clearly. A muddle-headed thief will get into serious trouble. If you examine thieves, they're very clear, chiseled in their thinking. If you examine all the corrupt people, they're very sharp. Unfortunately, I've had to work with civil service officers, IAS men, right? They're very sharp, but sharp in practicing corruption. Corruption. So they also think, right? But that's not the kind of thinking that we are talking about. It is thinking of a higher order. The kind of thinking that prevails in the world, the thinking that smart people of the world undertake, people who are only focused on inflating their self interest, the corrupt of the world, they think in terms of the lowest possibilities, how to exploit the existing situation, how to cheat and fool people, how to break all laws without getting caught. They're incapable of higher thought. No, you may look at these IAS officers and think that they are they've reached somewhere. And I feel sorry for them. I don't say this in a kind of avuncular fashion. I've dealt with so many of them in my times. I've not come across a single IAS, and I've written about that in my book um, um, uh, on a stormy course. What happens to the IAS cadre and all that? Um, I found them incapable of noble thoughts. Unfortunately, this is true also of Christians, Christian leaders, laity, whatever. Whereas it's highly important for us to cultivate the art of thinking high. While explaining the significance or meaning of the resurrection, Paul says, and you find it in the letter to Colossians, now that Jesus is resurrected from the dead, set your minds on things that are high. Okay? Now, in the seventh chapter of Matthew's Gospel, verse 5, Jesus says, cast not your pearls before swine, lest they trample them underfoot and turn round and rend you, right? What do we mean by the symbol of the pig? The pig also thinks, but its thinking is so limited to its stomach. Its thinking is low, the lowest level of thinking. And if Christians develop allergy to thinking, and they think that their passage to heaven is assured by starving their intellectual capacities, then the distinction between them and this proverbial pig disappears. And it is so disappointing to deal with people of that kind. And I have to say this, having worked in the field of education, I'm really alarmed at the poverty of thinking among teachers, not in schools alone, but in school and colleges and universities. On the whole, in our culture, in our society today, richness of thought is fast evaporating. And therefore, you find the human stature to be dwindling. They're very petty men, people whose interests are so low. You look in vain for men and women of stature. And this is a very serious problem. So you can't really have life in its fullness if you're poor in your emotional life and we are crippled in your thinking life of thought. Right? Now, if you write the history of the world, in a sense, the history of the world is the history of humankind is also the history of thought. It is not the history of eating. It's the history of thought. And what's called the life of the mind. The life of the mind. And therefore, I am not surprised that when Paul writes to Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, he writes, therefore, let this mind be let this mind be in you, which was also in Jesus Christ. So he's putting the emphasis on mind. Now, you're aware of the cardinal commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. That was the Old Testament version, the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 4. That we should love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength. It is Jesus who adds mind to it. So when it's recorded in the 27th verse of the 10th chapter of Luke's Gospel, It reads as, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, which does not exist in the Old Testament version. So that's a kind of emphasis or importance that Jesus attaches to the life of the mind. And as I said, Jesus' intelligence is not the kind of crude, rational mind. It's a sanctified, blessed, creative intelligence. Creative intelligence. The like of which I can only look at from a distance and admire. The system of education of which I was a parasite does not promote this at all. No system of education existing today can actually help young people develop this creative intelligence. But it is something that we can attain on our effort by trying to develop it. And I say this as someone who's made a little effort in that direction. So it's very important for us to feed our mind. Okay. And if our mind is famished, if our mind is bankrupt, as our heart is, then I don't know how in the world we can actually enter into life in all its fullness, right? So that's the second dimension. The third dimension that I find in Jesus Christ is his tremendous, tremendous willpower. Willpower. Now, you know that universally humankind suffers from paralysis of will. Now, classic example is the letter to Romans, chapter 7, where Paul makes a confession. Paul the apostle says that I'm paralyzed in my will. I uh, I want to do what is right. I know the good thing that I should be doing. And I also know the evil things I want to avoid. But I cannot bring myself to doing the good that I want to do. I end up doing the evil that I hate. He's actually talking about the huge problem, the universal problem of the paralysis of will. Many of us, in fact, every one of us has very good intentions. Just ask ourselves, how many of those good intentions we have translated into action? See, every one of us wants to be, upright, right? Hardworking, organized, disciplined, dignified, and completely immune to temptations, free from all weaknesses, and capable of making a difference where we are. All that we want, but we do nothing in that direction. Not because we do not know what to do, but because our will is paralyzed. In a sense, we are very much like that paralytic portrayed in the second chapter of the Gospel of Mark. He has to be carried on a pallet by four people. He cannot do anything for himself. He's completely now. Jesus identifies, Jesus diagnoses his problem right. Jesus' diagnosis is that there is nothing wrong with his body. Everything is wrong with his will. That is why Jesus says, take up your bed and walk. Your problem is that you're paralyzed in your will. And unless and until that is set right, no amount of medicine will help you. You can go to hundreds of doctors, none of them will be able to help you. There are many people like this in the medical world whose problems are not properly diagnosed. They go on being treated without any significant results. Unfortunately, doctors do not have the requisite degree of spiritual training to recognize these things. Right? This paralysis of will is a serious problem. Okay, and I wonder, I tremble to think of what would have happened to us if Jesus was also paralyzed in his will. You know what willpower it takes to accept the cross? After all, the Garden of Gethsemane is portrayed in the Bible just to make us understand that it's not a walk in the park, right? It takes the ultimate in willpower, the awesome strength. I'm quoting a few words from the English poet T.S. Eliot in his verse drama called Murder in the Cathedral. The awesome strength to surrender my will to your will in love. The awesome strength of self surrender. Now, this with my weakness in particular. So I've had to fight very hard against it. My witness to you is that this weakness can be overcome. How? That is where faith counts. When our will is weak, faith alone can come to our help. If we have faith, Jesus says, if you have faith as large as a mustard seed, you ask the mountain to move and it will move. The point is that you will never ask the mountain to move, because to ask you need to have willpower. Okay? But how can you ask when your will is paralyzed? So that's why Jesus creates a connection between the strength of will and the power of faith. So when we have faith, we overcome our weakness in will. As a result, we get involved with actual life situations of stress and strain, struggle and suffering, of meeting people's needs, of being one with them in the suffering of their life, so on and so forth. And the more we do that, the more we grow, not only in terms of our willpower, but also in terms of our emotional life and our thinking life, both. Now, as a teacher situated in the domain of higher education, I've been acutely aware of the poverty of our education system. And that poverty is learning is totally divorced from direct personal experience. And therefore, thinking always remains academic and abstract. As a result, our brain does not grow to the full possible extent. So what I did was in 2003, when I was just 52 years old and I had 13 years of service left, I resigned my job from St. Stephen's College. I got out of the academic world and I became a social activist. Why did I do that? Because I wanted to experience reality. And I tell you that my next 3 years of rough and tough, when I was in the midst of the people, I had to learn Hindi. My Hindi was so weak, but I could give passion only in Hindi. So I tried to improve my Hindi. I struggled and renounced all comforts of life. At times I slept on, in Harijan colonies and in very, very meager accommodations, sometimes on verandas. Really roughed it out. But that gave me an amazing sense of reality, which has sharpened my capacity to think. So I believe it's for others to judge. Okay. If you want clarity of understanding and power of communication, you have to move into the world of realities. As long as you are living among shadows, you will never develop. Now, how did Jesus live? He lived among people, surrounded by their problems, addressing their needs, stretching himself to an awesome extent, giving himself, giving liberally of himself, and ultimately giving his life as a ransom for the sins of the world. I mean, think of the richness of the content of Jesus's life. And then you see these three dimensions: his emotional life, his creative intelligence, and his amazing willpower. When he says, "Not my will, but thine be done," right? So it is this kind of model that Jesus has given to us, that we may have life in its fullness. What have we done? We have turned that expression into something cultic. Now, I've given my life to Jesus on the seventh day of the eighth month of 1982. From that day onwards, I have fullness of life. I mean, I can't think of anything more stupid and dishonest than this. We have to grow continually towards life in its fullness. And that need to grow does not end till the very last breath of our life. And notice that time is up, so I'm going to conclude. Right? So there is a goal before us, and that goal has become far more important and imperative today than, say, 50 years ago. Life ahead is going to be difficult and demanding. We can't afford to be like this. We are weak. We're incapable of facing the full thrust of life. We don't have to be like this. There needs to be a complete revamping of all our stereotypical ideas about Christianity, our set practices of Christianity, our ways of doing religion, so on and so forth. The emphasis has to be now overwhelmingly on the need to equip the saints, to enable people to grow in their spiritual stature, to lead people into life in all its fullness. Nothing short of this will work. We're all going to be put to the test. And my hope and prayer is that when the moment comes, we may not be found wanting. Thank you, and God bless all of you.
Yeah, thank you so much once again for a very rich, powerful message that